Secondary colleagues, we're going to go ahead and take a swing at this and hope that no screaming children come running in behind me or anything like that. When Jen approached, well, there we go. Okay, let's try this at nighttime. The PD is going to look pretty simple. There's 3 different modules, and we're talking about a total of, over the course of all the modules, about 3 hours of time. Modules 1 and 2 are going to be asynchronous. You can complete them at whatever time is most convenient for you. You can break them up into as many chunks as you need to break them into. They're delightfully asynchronous. And in the first module, you're not going to have much choice because there's 2 articles that we're going to read. And then in the second module, you have a lot of choice. There's about a dozen or so articles that I'll give you as a menu, all within this umbrella of the science of learning. And then in the third module, you're going to select a Zoom session. Doesn't matter what building you're in, just select the session that you most prefer. And we're going to discuss what we learned from the articles, what connects with what we already knew, and what applications we see. And that's where the real fruitful discussion will be, I hope, is what might this mean for the fall? How can this inform our preparations for the fall, knowing that we know so little about what the fall may be like in terms of format. Okay, so before we get into the articles, I want to just talk a little bit about this term, the science of learning. As Jen said, we're trying to align professional development a little bit across the district. It's a big project, but the goal would be that as the years stack onto each other, there's a sense of coherence in the professional development opportunities that the district provides, and that it builds to something, right? So that we as a district have collective knowledge that we all share, even though we're so different. We've got many teachers in the district teaching for their very first year, and we've got plenty who are more than 3 decades in. And we've got people in our secondary group doing math for 6th graders and science for 12th graders and music and art and physical education and health and all these different things. So, you know, designing PD is a bit of a challenge. And let me just take this opportunity to apologize because I kind of hemmed and hawed what to include in this professional development. And that's why it's so late. So if you want to be, if you want to egg somebody's house for this PD coming to you a little bit late, egg one of my neighbors. That would be a great thing to do. And then I'll see that and I'll realize, oh, they were upset with me. I'm going to try to be faster next time. So the science of learning. I want to, right out of the gate, make very clear that this professional development direction does not mean that there's not still an art to teaching or a craft to teaching, room for individuality in teaching, room for experience in teaching. It's not saying that at all. It is just saying that there's also obviously a science for teaching and learning. There are things that enough studies have been conducted for us to be able to quite reasonably say this is just true about the way that people learn. And there's other things where enough studies have been conducted for us to be able to reasonably say this is not true. This theory doesn't actually make sense. We can forget about this. Sometimes I'll hear a well-meaning teacher say every child is different. Every child is different, and every child learns differently. And some of that's true. Every child is different. I believe that. Every child is unique and fearfully and wonderfully and thoughtfully crafted. But at the same time, not every child learns completely differently. The human brain is very complex, amazingly complex. But it's not infinitely complex. There's not unlimited variation to the human brain. I mean, at the end of the day, it is the same organ inside of my head and your head. It's made out of the same stuff. So there's just some things that work better than others in getting this thing to change and grow and acquire new information and skills. What we're going to look at are 2 things in this first module. One thing, that there's enough evidence for us to reasonably conclude that it's not something that we need to worry about. It's not a thing that deserves our attention and thought as we think about the fall. We can just let this go. If we haven't let this go, we can now do that. There's enough evidence to say, one less thing to think about. And then we're going to look at, in our second article, a different thing that there's enough evidence to say this really matters. Like, this matters if we want our students to think and get better at thinking. This matters if we want our students to have a better time in school. This matters if we would like our students to go out into the world and be creative and critical thinkers. So first we'll look at the thing that we can get rid of, then we'll look at the thing that we can't. And as you read these articles, I want you to think about the evidence that the author is giving to support the conclusions that the author is making. Because obviously it's ridiculous to claim a science of learning if there's not evidence supporting the conclusions of the science. Last, before we dive in, I am going to offer a read aloud on both of the articles in this first module. I'm going to do that not because I think you're a child or you need to be read aloud to, but because I have found in preparing for this PD that it's nice when I can listen to this material while doing something else that I need to do. So if you got some dishes in the sink, go fire them up and listen to me read you these articles. You want to go take a jog, take a walk, go do it. Go in the garden, go ahead. Or you can just find the articles that I'm reading, just Google search for them, print them off for yourself, and you can go ahead and skip ahead in the video to the parts where you see me talking again in kind of a full screen version like this. I give a little bit of commentary at times while I'm reading the articles. I'm really just doing that to help the person who's listening to these things and doing the dishes or whatever. I'm just doing that to give them a little bit of processing time. All right, I think that's enough about that. Behold, the award-winningly designed website of Daniel Willingham. This guy's got the MeWe link in case you want to check him out on MeWe. I don't know if that's like a close cousin of MySpace. Kind of sounds like it. He also has a follow me on Twitter badge that looks like it might be the first follow me on Twitter badge ever designed. You probably need a photo. Let's check one of those out. Boom! There we go. Now we're talking. Take a look at this gentleman. I really like that one. All right. I'm giving Daniel a little bit of a hard time, but let's be honest, it's jealousy. This guy is a professor at the University of Virginia. I'm not jealous about that. But he's so smart. He's been writing for teachers specifically about the findings of cognitive science for over a decade. He communicates exceptionally well. Did I mention that he's really smart? I get the impression he's a good teacher. Part of the reason I think he's a good teacher is that he's really nice to other teachers. Always a good trait. And he's just got all of these freely available articles where he walks through the different consensuses of the cognitive science research and answers relevant questions to us. Why is transfer so hard? Critical thinking, why is it so hard to teach? 21st century skills, what's up with those? Can reading comprehension be taught? What's the role of sleeping in learning? What goes into mathematical thinking? What will improve a student's memory? I could go on and on. He's got a nice body of work. I like that guy's body of work. So most of our articles are either going to come from Dr. Willingham and his writing, or there'll be articles that I learned about through Dr. Willingham and his writing. All right, the first article that I want us to look at together is Dan Willingham's most recent piece on learning styles. So he has an earlier piece. Both of them are for the American Federation of Teachers. They've got this really high quality column called Ask the Cognitive Scientist. And the writers in this column are really top notch. So we're going to go ahead and read this aloud, and then we'll do a little post-reading analysis. And then after that, we'll do our second article. All right, Ask the Cognitive Scientist. Does tailoring instruction to learning styles help students learn? By Daniel T. Willingham. Question. In 2005, you wrote that there was no evidence supporting theories that distinguish between visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. I still attend professional development sessions that feature learning styles theories, and newer teachers tell me these theories are part of teacher education. Is there any update on this issue? Answer. Research has confirmed the basic summary I offered in 2005. Using learning styles theories in the classroom does not bring an advantage to students. But there is one new twist. Researchers have long known that people claim to have learning preferences. They'll say, I'm a visual learner, or I like to think in words. There's increasing evidence that people act on those beliefs. If given the chance, the visualizer will think in pictures rather than words. But doing so confers no cognitive advantage. People believe they have learning styles and they try to think in their preferred style, but doing so doesn't actually help them think. So that's kind of the intro to the article, the quick Q&A, and now he jumps into the proper beginning. Different children learn differently. This observation seems self-evident and just as obviously poses a problem for teachers. How are they supposed to plan lessons that reach all these different learners? The job might be easier if the differences were predictable or consistent. If a teacher knew that of the 25 students in her class, 12 learned this way and 13 learned that way, she could plan accordingly. She could teach this way and that way to separate groups of students, or she could be sure to include some of this and that in the whole class lesson plans. The question is, what is this and that? It's fairly obvious that some children learn more slowly or put less effort into schoolwork, and researchers have amply confirmed this intuition. Strategies to differentiate instruction to account for these disparities are equally obvious. Teach at the learner's pace, and take greater care to motivate the unmotivated student. But do psychologists know of any non-obvious student characteristics that teachers could use to differentiate instruction? Learning styles theorists think they've got one. They believe students vary in the mode of study or instruction from which they benefit the most. Again, the learning style theorists think that students vary in the mode of study or instruction from which they benefit the most. For example, one theory has it that some students tend to analyze ideas into parts, whereas other students tend to think more holistically. Another theory posits that some students are biased to think verbally, whereas others think visually. When we define learning styles, it's important to be clear that style is not synonymous with ability. Ability refers to how well you can do something. Style is the way you do it. I find an analogy to sports useful. Two basketball players might be equally good at the game, but have different styles of play. One takes a lot of risk, whereas the other is much more conservative in the shots she takes. To put it another way, you'd always be pleased to have more ability, but one style is not supposed to be valued over another. It's just the way you happen to do cognitive work. But just as a conservative basketball player wouldn't play as well if you forced her to take a lot of chancy shots, learning styles theories hold that thinking will not be as effective outside of your preferred style. In other words, when we say someone is a visual learner, we don't mean they have a great ability to remember visual detail, although that might be true. Some people are actually good at remembering visual detail, and some people are good at remembering sound, and some people are gifted in moving their bodies. That's kind of obvious because pretty much every human ability varies across individuals. So some people will have a lot of any given ability, and some will have less. There's not much point in calling variation in visual memory a style, when we already use the word ability to refer to the same thing. So I think it's an important distinction that Willingham's making there, this idea that, yes, it's true that people have differing abilities, but we shouldn't conflate that with a difference in style. He goes on. The critical difference between styles and abilities lies in the idea of style as a venue for processing, a way of thinking that an individual favors. Theories that address abilities hold that abilities are not interchangeable. I can't use a mental strength, for example, my excellent visual memory, to make up for a mental weakness, for example, my poor verbal memory. The independence of abilities shows us why psychologist Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is not a theory of learning styles. Far from suggesting that abilities are exchangeable, Gardner explicitly posits that different abilities use different codes in the brain and therefore are incompatible. You can't use the musical code to solve math problems, for example. Learning styles theories, in contrast, predict that catering to the preferred processing mode of a student will lead to improved learning. So again, the theory that we're looking at here is the theory that if you cater to the preferred processing mode of a student, then you'll end up having that student learn better. So, Willingham asks, what does the evidence say? Does honoring a student's learning style help? There are scores of learning styles theories, some going back to the 1940s. Enough research had been conducted by the late 70s that researchers began to write review articles summing up the field. And they concluded in the 70s that little evidence supported these theories. Research continued into the 1980s, and again, when researchers compiled the experiments, they reported that the evidence supporting learning styles theories was thin. And if you're listening to this, there's citations all throughout this article. So again, find this article online and you'll be able to look up the citations or the studies and articles that Willingham is citing. In 2008, Professor Hal Pashler and his associates reviewed the literature and drew the same conclusion. But they also noted that many of the existing studies didn't really test for evidence of learning styles in the ideal way. For example, if you want to test the verbalizer-visualizer distinction, it's not enough to show that visualizers remember pictures better than verbalizers do. Maybe those people you categorize as visual learners simply have better memories overall. You need to examine both types of learners and both types of content and show that words are better than pictures for the verbalizers and that the opposite is true for the visualizers. So here Willingham's getting at the importance of experimental design. Just because an experiment supposedly shows something, we have to take a look at the design to make sure that it actually does. The article by Pashler and colleagues prompted a microburst of articles on learning styles. But their warning that many prior studies were poorly designed went unheeded, and much of the recent research is uninformative. So a big argument made by this Pashler article in the first decade of the 2000s is that the evidence for learning style theory is really weak, partially because the studies that support learning style theory supposedly they're just badly designed. They don't actually demonstrate the validity that if you teach a student according to their learning style, the student will learn better. Okay, continuing. Nevertheless, some studies are interpretable, and 3 published since 2008 claim support for a learning styles theory. For example, one group of researchers reported that active learners benefit more from brainstorming, whereas reflective learners benefit more from instruction and recall. In another study, one researcher compared 3 modes of web-based instruction and reported differences in input-oriented and perception-oriented learners. But both articles had the same drawback. They used such a small number of experimental subjects, 9 to 11 subjects per group, that there's a real chance the results were flukes. So again, he's getting here at the experimental design. You have such a small group that you're studying, you can't necessarily make huge claims based on the results when the group is so small. The third experiment claimed positive results when testing psychologist Robert Sternberg's theory of self-government. Sternberg describes some learners as legislative, meaning they like to be able to create their own learning experiences without restraint, so they would learn best when allowed to skip learning materials. Executive learners like to follow directions, so they would learn best with clear guidance about what to do and when to do it. And judicial learners like to judge things and compare them, so they would learn best with lots of materials that they can compare. The researchers had subjects learn in an online environment with instruction matched, 3 groups, or mismatched, 6 groups, to their learning style. The outcome measure was a little unusual. Participants were asked to reflect on the material they had learned, and 2 raters evaluated the quality of these reflections. The researchers reported better reflections from students when the instructional method matched their preferred style than when it did not, but a breakdown showing exact group performance was not provided. So, 3 studies show results with some promise for 2 different learning styles theories. which indicates the theories merit further investigation. So he differentiates here wisely between single studies that give results saying, hey, we should look into this more, versus definitive studies that kind of conclusively, more definitive studies or groups of studies that would give us confidence making a conclusion about the theories. Okay, so 3 studies show results with some promise for 2 different learning styles theories, which indicates that theories merit further investigation. But 13 other published papers testing 5 different learning styles theories in both natural settings and laboratories show no support for learning styles theories. Although all of them tested students beyond the K-12 years, likely because that group was easiest for the experimenters to access, each theory predicts that differences would be observed in higher education settings. As with the few studies showing positive results, the studies showing negative results are often imperfect. For example, some needed more participants. But experiments were carefully designed. For example, one study provides a straightforward, powerful test of the verbalizer-visualizer distinction. In the study, 204 university students took a questionnaire meant to measure their proclivity to learn in one of 4 ways: visually, auditorily, via reading or writing, or kinesthetically. In the next phase of the experiment, participants heard 20 statements, read one at a time. Half of the participants were to rate each statement for how well they could form a vivid mental image based on the statement. The other participants were asked to focus on the auditory aspect of the statement by judging how well they could pronounce it. Participants were not forewarned that they would be tested on information from the sentences, but the third phase posed 20 questions about them. Everyone got more questions right if they performed the imagery task, about 16 questions right, compared with the auditory task, about 8 questions right. That result didn't change at all if the questionnaire classified participants as more of a visual learner or more of an auditory learner. In short, recent experiments do not change the conclusion that previous reviewers of this literature have drawn. There is not convincing evidence to support the idea that tailoring instruction according to learning styles theory improves student outcomes. Now, you may protest that I've disparaged some studies as poorly done. I should also note that the research covers only some of the existing theories of learning styles. So maybe tailoring lessons to students' learning styles could help. It's just that no one has done a good experiment to show that. That is possible, of course. In fact, even if 100 terrific experiments failed to support the visual auditory learner distinction, we could still say, well, maybe all 100 experiments were set up in the wrong way to show that learning styles do matter. Let's try experiment number 101. When it comes to scientific theories, this is really important. You can't prove a negative proposition beyond any doubt. So this is such a key thing, because a lot of times we as educators will say, we'll just be, well, I always tell my students, it's good to be skeptical, but like many things, if you do it too much, if you take it too far, it's actually bad, right? So it's good to be skeptical and to question the things that you hear to determine if they're really true. But sometimes you're actually just going to waste a ton of time and effort and energy by being skeptical, when in fact you'd be much wiser to accept something when you receive a reasonable enough amount of evidence to support the acceptance of that thing. So Willingham is saying that the way science works is you can't ever permanently prove a negative proposition, or you can't ever prove it beyond any doubt, because there's always another experiment that you could do. But, he goes on, are we sure it's wrong? Is a bad criterion. We should ask whether there is good evidence supporting the theory. After all, if we're considering letting this theory influence classroom practice, we should be as sure as we can be that it's true. It's not enough to be able to say we can't be certain it's false. So again, he's basically saying you're going to use effort and energy to enact learning styles theory in your classroom. So if you're going to use effort and energy to enact learning styles theory in your classroom, then you want to just ask yourself, is there enough evidence to support me doing this effort? Because I don't have unlimited time and effort and energy. I've got a life outside of teaching. So I want to use my time and effort and energy as wisely as I can. Therefore, I only want to be doing the things, putting effort into the things that are supported by as much evidence as possible. All right, so this next section is a little bit thorny at first, but I don't want to cut it out because he eventually gets to, I think, interesting things about the power of instruction compared to the power of thinking in your preferred learning style. Okay, and that's good news for us teachers who, we do instruction. So the section is titled Evidence That People Act on Their Learning Style. Research from the last 10 years confirms that matching instruction to learning style brings no benefit, but other research points to a new conclusion. People do have biases about preferred modes of thinking, even though these biases don't actually help them think better. Researchers used a clever task to show that verbalizers and visualizers do try to use their preferred mode of processing. First, the experimenters created stimuli that could be verbal or visual. Participants either saw an image with 3 features, for example, a picture of a blue triangle with stripes, or on the screen they saw a verbal description of the features, so the words blue, stripes, triangle. The task they performed was a similarity judgment. A target figure appeared briefly, and then subjects saw 2 more figures and had to judge which one was more similar to the target. The more similar figure always shared 2 of the 3 features. Both the target and the 2 choices could either be visual or verbal. So there were 4 types of trials. A picture of a triangle, that's visual, visual. Visual, verbal, verbal, visual, and verbal, verbal. The experimenters measured brain activity while participants performed the task, and they found evidence that participants recode the target to match their learning style. The more someone reported being a verbalizer, the more likely they were to show increased activity in the verbal parts of their brain when they were presented with images. The more they reported being a visualizer, the more likely they were to show increased activity in the visual parts of their brain when they were presented with words. It's worth noting that the survey identifying participants as verbalizers or visualizers was administered at least 2 weeks before the experiment. This is a smart part of the design. The experimenters wanted to ensure that people doing the task didn't act in accordance with the style simply because they had just finished the survey, which may have made them think about being a verbalizer or a visualizer. So they designed their experiment to make sure that these are people who have a settled sense of themselves as a verbalizer or a visualizer. And then way after they forgot taking that survey, now they came in and did these tasks. So this result shows that people actually act on their reported preference, changing a task so they can think in words or pictures as they like. But that doesn't mean that changing a task to fit your style makes you think better. An obvious prediction for a learning styles theory would be that visualizers would be better at this task when the stimuli were pictures, and verbalizers would be better when they were words. But matching the task, this is key, but matching the task to individuals' preferred learning styles did not predict task performance. Other experiments exploring the verbalizer-visualizer distinction showed the same pattern. Depending on their self-identified learning styles, people seek out written instructions or diagrams, or look at one or the other type of information longer. Similar data have been observed in the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic framework. Another example of people acting on their learning styles concerns the difference between intuitive and reflective modes of thinking. Here's a simple problem to illustrate the difference. A small vase holds 1 white ball and 9 red balls. A large vase holds 10 white balls and 91 red balls. From which vase should you randomly select a ball if you hope to get a white one? Intuitive thinking is fast and uses simple associations and memory to generate an answer. So it would lead you to select a large vase. That vase has more white balls, so you figure you're more likely to get a white one. The reflective mode of thinking is slower and relies on deeper, more analytic processing of available information. It would lead you to calculate the probability of drawing a white ball from each vase and ultimately to the correct answer, the smaller vase. Everyone uses both modes of thinking at different times, but individuals are biased to start with one or another type of processing. especially if nothing in the environment, like instructions or a time limit, nudges them toward one or the other. But most problems are not open to equally good solutions through either type of processing. This is important. Most problems are not open to equally good solutions through either type of processing. In other words, there are better ways to think about different types of problems than others, regardless of our preferences. He goes on, probability problems like the vase example are better solved through reflection, even if your bias is toward intuition. Creativity problems that benefit from free association are better solved by intuition, not reflection. The data show that people do have some propensity to use one or another mode of thinking, but people would be better off if they didn't. Rather, they should use the mode of thinking that's a better fit for the task at hand. This suggestion, tune your thinking to the task, assumes that people have the flexibility to process as they choose. To use an example from a different learning styles theory, we're assuming your status as a verbalizer can be overridden if you want to think about something visually. And there's evidence that that's true. In a recent study, researchers asked participants to navigate virtual cities. They found that verbalizers showed better memory for landmarks, but visualizers made more accurate judgments about the relative directions of city features. In a second experiment, the researchers instructed people to act like a verbalizer or a visualizer. People were able to follow these instructions, and the results matched what happened when they let people process as they pleased. Thinking verbally helped with landmarks, and thinking visually helped with direction. Important to our purposes, the effective instruction overwhelmed learning style. When told to process in a manner inconsistent with their preferred style, everyone showed the same memory effect. Okay, so what he's saying here is that there are studies that demonstrate that you can override your learning preference, and that you can be instructed to override your learning preference, and that if you are instructed to override your learning preference in a way that best suits the problem that you're being faced with, you'll learn better. We saw the same pattern in the experiment discussed earlier that used sentence memory to test the verbalizer-visualizer distinction. You can remember sentences by thinking visually or verbally, but there's a huge advantage to the former strategy, and it works just as well no matter what your preferred style. And some people do appear to have biases to process information one way or another, at least for the verbalizer-visualizer and the intuitive reflective styles, but these biases do not confer any advantage. Nevertheless, working in your preferred style may make it feel as though you're learning more. But if people are biased to think in certain ways, maybe catering to that bias would confer an advantage to motivation, even if it doesn't help thinking. Maybe honoring learning styles would make students more likely to engage in class activities. I've thought both of these things too. I'm glad he's bringing it up. He goes on, I don't believe either has been tested, but there are a few reasons I doubt we'd see hypothetical benefits. First, these biases for learning styles are not that strong, and they are easily overwhelmed by task features. For example, you may be biased to reflect rather than to intuit, but if you feel hurried, you'll abandon reflection because it's time-consuming. Second, and more important, there are the task effects. Even if you're a verbalizer, if you're trying to remember sentences, it doesn't make sense for me to tell you to verbalize, for example, by repeating the sentence to yourself, because visualizing, for example, by creating a visual mental image, will make the task much easier. Making the task more difficult is not a good strategy for motivation. So in that paragraph, he's basically saying, well, what about the idea that learning style theory, teaching to the learning styles of students or the learning preferences of students, couldn't that maybe give a motivation advantage? And he's saying the motivation advantage will be better if you actually just teach them the best way to learn that particular thing. So, if you teach students to operate on their learning preference, when their learning preference isn't actually the best way to learn a certain thing, then you're teaching them to make the task more difficult for themselves. And that difficulty will make them less successful, crush their efficacy, and that's really going to hurt their motivation. I love that idea. And then the idea of honoring learning styles make them more likely to engage in class activities. Again, student engagement is more of a function of deep beliefs about the given context than it is about the degree to which we honor their learning style. So, kind of the closing section here. Let's review the conclusions we can draw from this research before we consider the implications for education. Conclusions, then implications. First, since the last major literature review in 2008, more experiments have been conducted to measure whether participants learn better when new content fits their purported style. The bulk of the evidence shows no support for style distinctions. This conclusion is in keeping with a great many prior findings. The following 4 conclusions are more tentative. So, I like that he makes that distinction. Second conclusion. There is emerging evidence that people have a propensity to engage in one style of processing over others. Only a few learning styles theories have been tested this way. But there seems to be pretty good evidence for the idea that visualizers and verbalizers are biased to process information in their preferred style, and that people may be biased toward either reflective or intuitive thinking. These biases, however, are not very strong. Third conclusion. The type of mental processing people use often has a substantial effect on task success. So the way we think about a task often has a big effect on our success. Reflective thinking is much better than intuitive thinking for probability problems. Imagery is much better than verbalizing for sentence memory. Fourth, people can control the type of processing they use. Some may prefer to think intuitively when solving a problem, but they can think reflectively if something in the environment prompts them to do so, or if they recognize it's the type of problem best addressed that way. Fifth and final conclusion, there's no evidence that overruling your bias in this way incurs a cost to thinking. In other words, visualizers may be biased to use mental imagery, but when verbalizers use it, they're just as successful in solving problems. Now, he's going to close with 2 implications. So this would fall into our next step category. One educational implication of this research is obvious. Educators need not worry about their students' learning styles. There's no evidence that adopting instruction to learning styles provides any benefit. Nor does it seem worthwhile to identify students' learning styles for the purpose of warning them that they may have a pointless bias to process information one way or another. The bias is only one factor among many that determine the strategy an individual will select. The phrasing of the question, the task instructions, and the time allotted all can impact thinking strategies. That's a key little sub-implication there, the idea that it's not even helpful for you to teach your students that they might be biased. He says you're better off just thinking about the task and the way that you frame the question that you give to a learner, because that will shape how they then go on to think and process. A second implication is that students should be taught fruitful thinking strategies for specific types of problems. Although there is scant evidence that matching the manner of processing to a student's preferred style brings any benefit, there's ample evidence that matching the manner of processing to the task helps a lot. Students can be taught useful strategies for committing things to memory, reading with comprehension, overcoming math anxiety, or avoiding distraction, for example. Learning styles do not influence the effectiveness of these strategies. So this is a big picture conclusion, and I'm going to say it right now. The big conclusion here, this will link in with our second module, is that good news. One less thing for you to think about in case you were. Learning styles really doesn't pose any benefit, according to the consensus of basic science, for you and I to think at all about the learning styles of our students. The evidence is so weak that we can focus on other places where the evidence is really strong. So some things where there is really strong evidence are strategies for committing things to memory. So if you have a class where students need to remember stuff, then there are strategies to help with that. Reading with comprehension, if you have a class where you're asking students to read things that you want them to comprehend. Overcoming math anxiety, there's good evidence for how to help students do that. Or avoiding distraction. You all have a class where you need to help students with that. Then we do have really good consensus of evidence about how to help students with those things. So those are going to form kind of our menu for Module 2. I'm going to give you a list of articles by Willingham, mostly by Willingham, some from others. And these are the articles that he's citing here in these footnotes. All right, so if one of those topics grabs your attention, make note of that for yourself. And in Module 2, pick articles that line up with that topic. Okay, how you doing? Might be a good time to pause the video, go do something else, go do another task. Maybe hop on your Google Classroom, see if you got any students to respond to. Whatever, just might be a good time to take a break. Next, we're going to go into our second and final shared article. This one is going to be on the role of what our students know in affecting things like their thinking, their ability to learn, and their reading comprehension. And this will be another article from Dan Willingham in that Ask the Cognitive Scientist series. So when you're ready, after you take a break, go ahead and we'll dive into the next article. All right, welcome back from intermission in Module 1. Just like the last article, I'm going to read aloud for your convenience if you prefer to draw a picture, maybe paint a picture, maybe weed your garden, take a little jog, little bike ride, whatever you want to do. You can allow me to read this to you for your convenience and pleasure. Or maybe you just want to find this article, just do a Google search, you'll find it, and you want to print it out for yourself so you can annotate and dig into it without having to listen to my voice. Totally respect that. If that's the case, just fast forward your video up to where you see me talking again without the article. And then I will, in that part, close up Module 1 of our PD. Okay, this article is by Daniel T. Willingham. It is a publication. It was published by the American Federation of Teachers in their spring 2006. How Knowledge Helps. It speeds and strengthens reading comprehension, learning, and thinking. Knowledge is good. So read the motto of the mythical Faber College in the 1978 movie Animal House. Those of us who work in education would agree, even if we were unable to express ourselves so eloquently. But why exactly is knowledge good? When I've discussed this question with teachers, many have used the metaphor, it's grist for the mill. That is, the goal of education is seen not so much as the accumulation of knowledge, but as the honing of cognitive skills such as thinking critically. Knowledge comes into play mainly because if we want our students to learn how to think critically, they must have something to think about. It's true that knowledge gives students something to think about, but a reading of the research literature from cognitive science shows that knowledge does much more than just help students hone their thinking skills. It actually makes learning easier. Knowledge is not only cumulative, it grows exponentially. Those with a rich base of factual knowledge find it easier to learn more. The rich get richer. In addition, factual knowledge enhances cognitive processes like problem solving and reasoning. The richer the knowledge base, the more smoothly and effectively these cognitive processes, the very ones that teachers target, operate. So, the more knowledge students accumulate, the smarter they become. We'll begin by exploring how knowledge brings more knowledge, and then turn to how knowledge improves the quality and speed of thinking. So he's making a really key and interesting distinction here, and he's helping me to understand how in the world my little brother, starting at the age of 10, was able to cite all these statistics about sports and then learn the constantly updated versions of those specifics of those statistics as the sports season progressed. He knew a ton of the statistics because the kid watched ESPN 24/7. And then it just made it really easy to constantly add to that knowledge. Now, Willingham is going to explain the cognitive science basis for this. Part 1, how knowledge brings more knowledge. The more you know, the easier it will be for you to learn new things. Learning new things is actually a seamless process, but in order to study it and understand it better, cognitive scientists have approached it as a 3-stage process. And they've found that knowledge helps at every stage. As you first take in new information, either via listening or reading, as you think about this information, and as the material is stored in memory. We'll consider each of these stages in turn. So he's saying what you know about a topic makes it easier to take in the new information, think about the new information, and store the new information. The more you know, the easier every part of the learning process is. So first, how knowledge helps you take in new information. The first stage in which factual knowledge gives you a cognitive edge is when you are taking in new information, whether by listening or reading. There's much more to comprehending oral or written language than knowing vocabulary and syntax. Comprehension demands background knowledge because language is full of semantic breaks in which knowledge is assumed, and therefore comprehension depends on making correct inferences. In a casual conversation, the listener can gather missing background knowledge and check on his inferences by asking questions. So if I'm talking to somebody, I can say, for example, did you mean Bob Smith or Bob Jones? What do you mean when you describe him as an entrepreneur? But this is not the case when watching a movie or reading a book. And sometimes it isn't the case in class when a student is too embarrassed to ask a question. To provide some concrete examples and simplify the discussion, let's focus on reading. So he's going to focus on reading, but he's going to make claims that are relevant to all of us who want kids to learn stuff. Keep in mind that this same point applies to listening. Suppose you read this brief text. John's face fell as he looked down at his protruding belly. The invitation specified black tie, and he hadn't worn his tux since his own wedding, 20 years earlier. You will likely infer that John is concerned that his tuxedo won't fit, although the text says nothing directly about this potential problem. The writer could add the specifics. John had gained weight since he last wore his tuxedo and worried that it would not fit. But they're not necessary, and the added words would make the text dull. Your mind is well able to fill in the gaps because you know that people are often heavier 20 years after their wedding, and that gaining weight usually means that old clothing won't fit. This background knowledge about the world is readily available, and so the writer doesn't need to specify it. Thus, an obvious way in which knowledge aids the acquisition of more knowledge lies in the greater power it affords in making correct inferences. If the writer assumes that you have some background knowledge that you lack, you'll be confused. For example, if you read, he was a real Benedict Arnold about it, and you don't know who Benedict Arnold was, you're lost. This implication of background knowledge is straightforward and easy to grasp. It's no surprise then that the ability to read a text and make sense of it is highly correlated with background knowledge. If you know more, you're a better reader. So that's an important paragraph saying that the ability to make an inference is really a function of what we know about the topic at hand. It's not like this transferable skill. Most of the time you are unaware of making inferences when you read. For example, when you read the text above, it's unlikely you thought to yourself, let me see now, why am I being told about the last time he wore his tuxedo? Why would thinking about that make his face fall? Those conscious inferences are unnecessary because the cognitive processes that interpret what you read automatically access not just the literal words that you read, but also ideas associated with those words. Thus, when you read tux, the cognitive processes that are making sense of the text can access not just a formal suit of clothing, but all of the related concepts in your memory. Tuxedos are expensive, they are worn infrequently, they are not comfortable, they can be rented, they are often worn at weddings, and so on. As the text illustrates, the cognitive processes that extract meaning also have access to concepts represented by the intersection of ideas. Tux makes available clothing, and 20 years after wedding makes available gaining weight. The intersection of clothing and gaining weight yields the idea clothing won't fit, and we understand why John is not happy. all of these associations and inferences won't happen. Oh, all these associations and inferences do happen outside of awareness. Only the outcome of this cognitive process, that John is concerned his text won't fit anymore, enters consciousness. Sometimes this subconscious inference-making process fails, and the ideas in the text can't be connected. When this happens, processing stops and a greater effort is made to find some connection among the words and ideas in the text. This greater effort requires conscious processing. For example, suppose that later in the same text you read, John walked down the steps with care. Janine looked him up and down while she waited. Finally, she said, "Well, I'm glad I've got some fish in my purse." Janine's comment might well stop the normal flow of reading. Why would she have fish? You would search for some relationship between carrying fish to a formal event and the other elements of the situation. Formal wear, stairs, purses, what you've been told of Janine and John. In this search, you might retrieve the popular notion that wearing a tuxedo can make one look a little like a penguin, which immediately leads to the association that penguins eat fish. Janine is likening John to a penguin, and thus she's teasing him. Sense is made and reading can continue. Here then is a second and more subtle benefit of general knowledge. People with more general knowledge have richer associations among the concepts of memory. And when associations are strong, they become available to the reading process automatically. That means the person with rich general knowledge rarely has to interrupt reading in order to consciously search for connections. This phenomena has been verified experimentally by having subjects read texts on topics with which they are or are not very familiar. For example, Johanna Kakinen and her colleagues in 2003 had subjects read a text about 4 common diseases, for example the flu, for which they were likely already familiar with the symptoms, and a text about 4 uncommon diseases, for example typhus, for which they likely were not. For each text, there was additional information about the diseases that subjects likely did not know. This is a cool experiment design. The researchers used a sophisticated technology to unobtrusively measure where subjects fixated their eyes while they read each text. Researchers thus had a precise measure of reading speed, and they could tell when subjects returned to an earlier portion of the text to reread something. The researchers found that when reading unfamiliar text, subjects more often reread parts of sentences, and they more often looked back to previous sentences. Their reading speed was also slower overall compared to when they read familiar texts. These measures indicate that processing is slower when reading about something unfamiliar to you. Which, by the way, folks, is a major insight into the fact that every single one of the courses that students at Cedar Springs Public Schools experience that teaches students something, anything about the world, automatically increases that student's ability to read texts about the subject that they've learned about. So if they're in a health class and they're learning about diseases, the things that they're learning in that unit on diseases are going to help them ever after read texts about diseases. It'll increase the ease with which they read and the productivity of their reading. Thus, background knowledge makes one a better reader in 2 ways. And remember, he said it also makes you a better listener. First, it means that there is a greater probability that you will have the knowledge to successfully make the necessary inferences to understand a text. For example, you'll know that people are often heavier 20 years after their wedding, and thus John is worried that his text won't fit. Second, rich background knowledge means that you will rarely need to reread a text in an effort to consciously search for connections in the text. For example, you will quickly realize that with her fish remark, Janine is likening John to a penguin. And so again, to go back to us at Cedar Springs Public Schools, the degree to which our students know more things about the world, about all the different subject areas, that predicts the ease with which they will learn in subsequent classes. All right, new section, how knowledge helps you think about new information. Comprehending a text so as to take in new information is just the first stage of learning that new information. The second stage is to think about it. So we take in new information, stage 1, we think about it, stage 2. This happens in what cognitive scientists call working memory, the staging ground for thought. Working memory is often referred to metaphorically as a space to emphasize its limited nature. One can maintain only a limited amount of information in working memory. For example, read through this list one time, then look away and see how many letters that you can recall. CN, NFB, ICB, SCI, ANC, AA. There were 16 letters on the list, and most people can recall around 7. There's not sufficient space in working memory to maintain more than that. Now try the same task again with this list. CNN, FBI, CBS, CIA, NCAA. It's much easier, right? If you compare the two lists, you'll see that they actually contain the same letters. The second list has been reorganized in a way that encourages you to treat C, N, and N as a single unit, rather than as 3 separate letters. Putting items together this way is called chunking. It greatly expands how much fits in your working memory, and therefore how much you can think about. The typical person's working memory can hold about 7 letters, or almost the same number, of multi-letter chunks, or pieces of information. Note, however, that chunking depends on background knowledge. If you were not familiar with the abbreviation for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you couldn't treat FBI as a single chunk. The ability to chunk and its reliance on background knowledge has been tested in a number of studies. These studies show that this ability makes people better able to briefly remember a list of items, just as you could remember more letters in the second example. This benefit has been observed in many domains, including chess, bridge, computer programming, dance steps, circuit design, maps, and music. Of course, we seldomly want to briefly remember a list. The important aspect of chunking is that it leaves more free space in working memory, allowing that space to be devoted to other tasks, such as recognizing patterns in material. For example, in one study, the researchers tested junior high school students who were either good or poor readers, as measured by a standard reading test, and who were also knowledgeable or not about the game of baseball, as measured by a test created for the study by 3 semi-professional baseball players. The children read a passage written at an early 5th grade reading level that described a half inning of a baseball game. The passage was divided into 5 parts, and after each part, the student was asked to use a replica of a baseball field and players to reenact and describe what they read. The researchers found that baseball knowledge had a big impact on performance. Poor readers with the high knowledge of baseball displayed better comprehension than good readers with a low knowledge of baseball. This is like a seminal study. It's by Recht and Leslie. It's from 1988. This is the baseball study. So kids who are supposedly good readers had lower comprehension on the baseball text if they had low knowledge of baseball than the kids who were bad readers but high knowledge of baseball. So the researchers demonstrated that the background knowledge for the text was a better indicator of reading ability for the text than supposed reading ability. What's going on here? First, the students with a lot of knowledge of baseball were able to read a series of actions and chunk them. For example, if some of the text described the shortstop throwing the ball to the second baseman and the second baseman throwing the ball to the first baseman, resulting in 2 runners being out, the students with baseball knowledge would chunk those actions and recognize them as a double play. But the students without baseball knowledge would have to try to remember the whole series of actions. And that uses up a lot of space in working memory. Second, because they were able to chunk, the students with baseball knowledge had free space in their working memory that they could devote to using the replica to reenact the play, as well as providing a coherent verbal explanation. Without being able to chunk, the students with little baseball knowledge simply didn't have enough free space in their working memory to simultaneously remember all the actions, keep track of their order, do the reenactment, and describe the reenactment. So these students experienced a task overload. Too much was being required of the working memory due to their lack of background knowledge. The study illustrates the importance of the working memory advantage that background knowledge confers. And he lists several other studies that you can look at to see the same effect. Most of the time when we are listening or reading, it's not enough to understand each sentence on its own. We need to understand a series of sentences or paragraphs and hold them in mind simultaneously so that they can be integrated or compared. Doing so is easier if the material can be chunked because it will occupy less of the limited space in working memory, but chunking relies on background knowledge. So again, I want to point out here, he's making a claim to how background knowledge helps you with reading, but also to listening, also to experiencing a lesson. It makes the learning that we ask of our students in a lesson easier when we have background knowledge. It makes our students listening to our instruction an easier task when they have background knowledge. And so too with reading. Third section, how knowledge helps you remember new information. Knowledge also helps when you arrive at the final stage of learning new information, remembering it. So he's got 3 stages in this article: taking in new information, thinking about new information, remembering new information. 3 stages of learning: taking in, thinking about, remembering. So knowledge also helps you with the remembering stage. Simply put, it's easier to fix new material in your memory when you already have some knowledge of the topic. And about 5 studies are listed here. Many studies in this area have subjects with either high or low amounts of knowledge on a particular topic read new material and then take a test on it sometime later. Inevitably, those with prior knowledge remember more. A study by David Hambrick in 2003 is notable because it looked at real-world learning and did so over a longer period of time than is typical in such studies. First, Hambrick tested college students for their knowledge of basketball. This test took place in the middle of the college basketball season. 2.5 months later, at the end of the season, subjects completed questionnaires about their exposure to basketball. For example, game attendance, watching television, reading magazines or newspapers. It also took tests that measured their knowledge of specific men's basketball events from the prior 2.5 months. The results showed, not surprisingly, that subjects who reported an interest in the game also reported that they had had greater exposure to basketball information. But the more interesting finding was that for a given level of exposure, greater prior basketball knowledge was associated with more new basketball knowledge. That is, the people who already knew a lot about basketball tended to remember more basketball-related news than people with the same exposure to this news, but less prior knowledge. As I said in the introduction, the rich get richer. What's behind this effect? A rich network of associations makes memory strong. New material is more likely to be remembered if it is related to what is already in memory. Remembering information on a brand new topic is difficult because there's no existing network in your memory that the new information can be tied to. But remembering new information on a familiar topic is relatively easy because developing associations between your existing network and the new material is easy. I'm wondering if you're listening to this, what applications you see to your teaching. This idea that a rich network of associations makes memory strong. New material is more likely to be remembered if it is related to what is already in memory. And remembering information on a brand new topic is difficult because there's no existing network in your memory that new information can be tied to. All right. Some researchers have suggested that prior knowledge is so important to memory that it can actually make up for or replace what we normally think of as aptitude. Some studies have administered the same memory task to high aptitude and low aptitude children, some of whom have prior knowledge on the subject matter, and some of whom do not. The studies found that only prior knowledge is important. But some researchers disagree. They report that, although prior knowledge always helps memory, it cannot eliminate the aptitude differences among people. Since everyone's memory gets better with prior knowledge, assuming equal exposure to new knowledge, as in a classroom without extra support for slower students, the student with overall lower aptitude will still be behind the student with higher aptitude. In the end, the issue is not settled, but as a practical matter of schooling, it doesn't matter much. What matters is the central undisputed finding. All students will learn more if they have greater background knowledge. Okay, so that was part 1 of the article, which discussed how knowledge brings more knowledge, makes it easier to learn. He also has a second part, how knowledge improves thinking, and he demonstrates using some different examples how knowledge helps you with problem solving and how it helps you to actually shortcut in your thinking. But I personally feel like we're pretty deep into all this stuff already, and that if you want, you can read that second part during Module 2. I want to end Module 1 with a sidebar where he talks about the practical ramifications for dealing with these truths about knowledge in the classroom. So this is a sidebar to the same article. Knowledge in the classroom. One sometimes hears that the real goal of education is learning to learn. As the proverb says, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he will eat for a lifetime. Better to teach students how to learn facts on their own rather than teach them facts. The idea sounds appealing, but if it's coupled with the idea that teachers should emphasize cognitive processes like comprehension and reasoning strategies and place less emphasis on content, then it's wrong. Just straightforward. The effects that I described in the main article indicate that many of the cognitive skills we want our students to develop, and we do, we want our students to read with understanding, we want them to listen with understanding, we want them to analyze problems, we want them to be good thinkers, we want all those things for our students. He says that those things that we want are intimately intertwined with knowledge of content. When students learn facts, they are not just acquiring grist for the mill. They are enabling the mill to operate more effectively. Background knowledge is absolutely integral to effectively deploying important cognitive processes. So, what does this mean for teachers? Well, first of all, it means that facts should be meaningful. Fact learning, Willingham says, should not be understood as rote memorization. The importance of knowledge to cognition does not mean that teachers should assign lists of facts for their students to memorize. As described in the main article, facts are useful only if they're meaningfully connected to other bits of knowledge. So if our students don't know how a fact matters, the fact won't help them very much. So fact learning should be thought of as the kind of learning that results from, for example, reading a richly detailed biography, not a barren timeline of a person's life. Teachers should include opportunities for students to learn new material about the world and connect it to prior knowledge wherever possible. Mindless drilling is not an effective vehicle for building students' store of knowledge. And I'm going to make a few clarifications here. So notice, mindless drilling is not an effective vehicle for building students' store of knowledge. But as all coaches know, intelligent drilling is actually a useful tool for building students' store of knowledge. It kills me when I hear people say drill and kill, as if all drills are identically designed and pointless. It's not the case. You look at some of the great teachers across the domains, for example, John Wooden, who considered himself a teacher of basketball, and there is a great reliance on certain types of intelligently designed drills to make his students master the fundamentals of basketball. I'm not saying we should turn all of our classes into a bunch of drill sequences, but I'm also saying the idea that drill and kill are synonymous is not a very evidence-supported position. And by the way, Willingham goes more into depth on how facts play a role in making our students more expert. He calls this inflexible knowledge, and he talks about how inflexible knowledge is a a non-skippable step in getting our students to do things like think like a historian or think like a scientist. Willingham argues that you can't actually just skip to the expert level thinking. You've got to do inflexible knowledge first. So that'll be another article option when we get to the module 2. All right, so first thing is that facts should be meaningful. Second thing, knowledge acquisition can be incidental. And he kind of alluded to this in the first thing. Every fact that students learn need not be explicitly taught. Students can learn facts incidentally. Incidental learning refers to learning that occurs when you are not specifically trying to learn. This is a beautiful thing about human beings. Much of what you know stuck in your memory not as a result of you consciously trying to remember it, but as a byproduct of thinking about it, such as when you reflect on a novel word that someone used in conversation, or are fascinated by a new fact. When schools use a content-rich curriculum, students have many incidental learning opportunities as they're immersed in meaningful, connected facts throughout the day. Teachers can also look for extra opportunities to provide incidental learning opportunities for their students. For example, by using a vocabulary word that the students likely do not know, but the meaning of which is deducible from the context of the sentence. So this second idea, knowledge acquisition can be incidental, is hugely liberating. If you've been feeling during this second article a pressure to create a classroom that's just a giant list of facts that students must be taught, it's not the full picture whatsoever. The actual objective is to each of us create classes that are as rich with material as possible so that our students are exposed to the many wonders of all our different disciplines. And along the way, in such a curriculum, they'll incidentally learn lots of things. Number 3, not all knowledge needs to be detailed. Note that the cognitive benefits described in this article differ in their knowledge requirements. For example, the knowledge required to increase reading comprehension is often fairly superficial. Using our examples from the main article, you don't need detailed knowledge about penguins or Arnold's life to understand what is meant by the relationship between a fish and a penguin, or between Benedict Arnold and a trader. Fortunately, this sort of superficial knowledge is easy to pick up incidentally. For example, a rich 4th grade unit on the American Revolution would likely include extensive information on key players such as King George III, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin, but nothing more on Benedict Arnold than an aside emphasizing his role as a trader. Such an aside would usually be enough to enhance reading comprehension. Most of us spend the majority of our time reading material intended for a general audience, and for that material, superficial knowledge is sufficient. Looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, deep knowledge is needed to attain benefits related to thinking, such as the recognition of a chunk, as in the example from the main article, the student who's memorized the distributed property. Practice in a number of different situations is required before knowledge can be used with ease for problem solving. So he's saying that for reading comprehension, you don't need to have in-depth knowledge for just basic comprehension of reading. For problem solving, you actually need to have a deeper knowledge. You need to see that knowledge play itself out in a number of different problem contexts. So that was number 3, not all knowledge needs to be detailed. And finally, Willingham's 4th point in this sidebar, knowledge learning should start early, is really focused on pre-K and early elementary grade levels. So for us as a 6th through 12th grade group, not really in our sandbox. You can read it at your leisure if you like, but for the sake of time, I'm going to close out Module 1. We're in Module 1. Yeah. Well, look at you and me. We've gotten to the end of Module 1. We've read 2, chunky articles from our new friend Daniel Willingham. I mean, I know a lot of you are longtime fans of the University of Virginia wonder known as Danny Dubs. We've covered learning style theory and what, as of 2018, were the consensuses from the research on learning styles. And hopefully for many of us, we took something off of our, subconscious that we're supposed to be doing. And then we looked at an article about the role that knowledge plays in allowing our students to learn more easily, and also to think better and to read better. And really all of that was quite a lot of work. So why don't you do something for you now? You go out and you take care of number one. Okay, maybe take a little power nap, eat some ice cream, call your grandmother. I don't know what you'd like to do, but I'd like you to do it. And then I'll see you in Module 2 after you've had a nice regenerative break.